Welcome to History Nachos. We do things a little differently. Names and dates take a back seat to humanity's greatest real stories. So sit back and enjoy the ride. China, 1331. A new disease appears. It is lethal and highly contagious. No cure exists. Catching it becomes a death sentence for millions of people. It reaches the Silk Road and begins spreading through the trade routes. The disease becomes weaponized, and generals begin using it against cities. The whole known world is infected. The disease decimates people on 3 continents. Doctors and priests rush to the rescue. The disease wipes them out. People across Asia, Europe, and Northern Africa struggle to survive. They fight the disease and each other. Welcome to Episode 10, Black Death, the real zombie apocalypse. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft. For the people who lived through the Black Death, one of the scariest aspects was that nobody knew what caused it. They knew that it spread, but could not figure out how. People tried everything. Religious rituals, medical research, quack treatments, and superstition were all fair game. The only certain thing was that gathering with other people risked catching the disease. For Halloween, I just could not resist making an episode about a real zombie apocalypse. The Black Death certainly fits the bill. Deadly epidemics were a constant throughout human history until a few generations ago. But nothing beats the widespread, simultaneous devastation of the Black Death. Thanks to modern science, we now know roughly what happened. The Black Death's formal Latin name is Yersinia pestis. It starts off as a bacteria in fleas on rodents, and spreads through flea bites. When a flea bites a human, the bacteria hits the on switch and goes ballistic. The Black Death often kills within a week, but the process is extremely painful. It starts out just like a bad flu. Fever, headache, chills, weakness. Then the bacteria hits the lymph nodes and really ramps up. Lymph nodes basically filter out your bloodstream and are located on the neck, armpits, and groin. The lymph nodes massively swell up into painful black bulges called buboes. Buboes in the groin cause lots of pain right by some highly sensitive parts. Eventually, the disease moves into the really nasty phase, where the victim begins to resemble a zombie. This is like when someone starts to turn in The Walking Dead. The plague either goes septicemic or pneumonic. Septicemic plague means internal bleeding while flesh turns black and dies until it kills the victim. Pneumonic plague means the bacteria enters the lungs and slowly drowns the victim in their own bodily fluids, on top of the other plague symptoms. The pneumonic plague is considered the worst one, and is highly contagious between humans. Either way, the Black Death makes Ebola look tame by comparison. In most zombie stories, people usually die first before the disease gets really nasty and turns them into shrieking horrors. With the Black Death, victims were alive and conscious while in the zombie phase. If the disease goes pneumonic, it can be spread through bodily fluids and coughing. Even in a fictional zombie apocalypse, the zombie usually has to bite someone to spread the infection. During the real deal, it just took a flea bite, being near the wrong person, or touching the wrong thing in the notoriously unclean and crowded conditions of the Middle Ages. Yersinia pestis also appeared in the perfect place: China. Even in the 13th century, China had one of the largest populations on Earth. Lots of crowded urban centers with rats. Many others lived in the country and dealt with animals every day. With well over 100 million people, the odds were pretty high someone would get bitten by an infected flea at some point. The Black Death's exact origin is still debated, but the earliest reports come from near western China in 1331. 3 years later, in 1334, the plague hit Hebei province, the suburbs of Beijing. Hebei province lost 90% of its population to the disease. 5 million gone in 1 year. China just became the real-life Walking Dead. Time to start panicking. Over the following years, the plague would bring widespread devastation to China. The Black Death also hit at the perfect time for it to spread. For most of history, China is relatively isolated from the rest of the world. However, the 1300s are a rare exception. The Mongols had completely taken over China and integrated it into an empire that stretched to the Middle East and the edge of Europe. Commerce along the Silk Road was at an all-time high, and people across the world wanted to buy stuff from China. Ladies and gentlemen, that is an ideal form of transmission for something like the Black Death. It did not take long for the disease to spread down the Silk Road. This was like in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, when an infected airline pilot brought the virus to an international airport. 1 year after wiping out Hebei province, the Black Death hit Persia, modern Iran. It even took out the Mongol regional governor. During the late 1330s and early 1340s, the Black Death also decimated several population centers along the Silk Road in modern Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and southern Russia. We are talking an estimated 40 to 70% dead, depending on the area. While part of the world was dealing with a zombie apocalypse, everywhere else life went on. In the 1340s, the Black Death was a terrible thing happening far away, like when the news talks about starving kids in a distant third world country. The Mongols even tried to continue expanding their empire despite a huge area dealing with the Black Death. Which brings us to Kaffa. Kaffa is a strategically located port on the northern side of the Black Sea. Genoese merchants had turned it into a trade hub. They ended up squaring off against the Mongols to keep control of Kaffa. The important thing is that Kaffa was held by Italian merchants and under siege by Mongols during the mid-1340s. About a year into the siege, the Mongol commander made two fateful decisions. The first was to ask for reinforcements, which came from the east. Turns out the reinforcements brought the plague with them. The Black Death struck the Mongol force hard, and the commander kept losing troops. Then the commander made a second critical decision. He loaded the dead bodies of infected soldiers into the catapults and hurled them over Kaffa's walls. The siege naturally turned in favor of the Mongols. The Mongols had a reputation for killing everybody at the end of a siege, so getting out became a matter of life and death. Many of the refugees scrambled to the boats and headed back home to Italy. Now the Black Death was on board ships bound for Western Europe, a port where trade ships traveled all over Europe and the Mediterranean. I think you can see where this is going. At the same time, the Black Death began spreading into the rest of the Middle East. Pilgrimages to Mecca further spread the plague all over the Islamic world. Everywhere from India to Armenia and North Africa got hit. Big cities lost thousands of people every day. The Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun lived through the Black Death, but lost his parents to the disease. Here is how he summed it up. Cities and buildings were laid waste. Roads and way signs were obliterated. Settlements and mansions became empty. Dynasties and tribes grew weak. The entire inhabited world changed. Sounds like a zombie apocalypse to me. The only thing missing is Woody Harrelson with a sawed-off shotgun. When the refugee ships from Kaffa returned back to Italy, the Black Death reached Western Europe. It spread like crazy during the late 1340s. By 1350, it was all over Europe and the Mediterranean, even Scandinavia and Russia. Europe took the hardest punch from the Black Death. One of the more consistently accepted death tolls is 2/3 of the population. Estimates indicate China lost roughly half its population, and the Middle East lost about a third. I am actually going to look at Europe in more detail for two reasons. Europe responded differently than everywhere else, and the Black Death in Europe is the most documented and studied area. So what made Europe different? First of all, the plague hit while China and the Middle East were near the peak of their civilizations. The standard of living was relatively high and clean for the time, the economy was great, and they had the most advanced medicine. Of course, these are all relative terms. Europe, on the other hand, was primed for an epidemic. Europe was still recovering from a prior apocalypse. In past episodes, I've compared the collapse of the Roman Empire to an EMP frying all electronics and causing a civilizational breakdown. Europe was just about to make a full recovery from Mad Max when it got flung straight into The Walking Dead. Europe's people were also physically weakened. In the early 1300s, tons of livestock died off from disease. Crops also began to fail due to overuse of the land, which caused massive famines about 30 years before the plague. The Earth also entered a cooler climate cycle, which greatly reduced crop yields long term. When the plague hit, almost everyone had grown up without enough nourishment, which probably compromised their immune systems. To make things worse, medieval Europe was absolutely filthy. The average living conditions would make modern people gag. Rats and fleas were just another unpleasant part of life. Europe was also made up of a bunch of independent nations in constant war with each other. We have already seen the effects of the Black Death in relatively peaceful areas. Adding the disruption of war into the mix creates a recipe for disaster. When the Black Death came into Europe, it was like dropping a lit match into underbrush during the dry season. The whole place went up as the disease spread like wildfire. Whenever someone in a town died of the plague, people immediately panicked and fled. Infected fleas would hitch a ride on their clothes, and the disease would spread even more. Some areas were fortunate and somehow got largely passed over by the plague. Most were not so lucky. Many places had to dig giant pits where people would dump the dead every day. It got so bad that multi-layered mass graves became standard practice. Doctors were the ones on the front lines trying to treat the Black Death. However, even the top medicine was still pretty primitive by modern standards. They had no concept of bacteria or infection, which hamstrung the doctors from the start. Given the Black Death's contagious nature, doctors started dropping like flies. Many of the surviving doctors began refusing to treat plague victims at all. People also thought the Black Death was an act of God, which made them turn to priests. When people did not know the cause of the disease, they started to rely on prayer. Spiritual solution to a spiritual problem. The job of the clergy also included visiting people in their homes, helping the sick, and conducting funerals. That is pretty much maximum exposure to the plague. Entire monasteries would routinely get totally wiped out, since all the monks lived so close together. It only took one monk to bring the infection in, then it was game over. Killing off the clergy also had other consequences. Back then, the clergy handled just about anything involving paperwork. Imagine what would happen to modern society if we lost almost all the lawyers, accountants, and business executives. It did not turn out well for medieval Europe. Not only was the Black Death killing everybody in general, it was killing lots of doctors who would normally work towards a cure. The top government leaders were fleeing for dear life to isolated areas of the countryside. The clergymen, who would normally keep things running at the local level, were dying by the truckload. Losing the clergy also took out the main social mechanism for keeping everyone calm during a crisis. From there, it was just a short leap to panic, hysteria, and the breakdown of law and order. The late 1340s and early 1350s is when things started to get really crazy in Europe. Everyone was dying, there was not enough food, the economy was taking a nosedive, the state was overwhelmed trying to get a lid on everything, and nobody really knew how the disease spread. Many people thought the world was ending. It became every man for himself. Families got ripped apart. Parents routinely would have to bury their spouses and children. For example, one guy buried all 5 of his children after losing them to the plague. People started isolating themselves, even from family members. You did not need to be a doctor to realize proximity to people created a huge risk. On top of everything else, people began to feel a sense of rage against the calamity. That is when they started to turn on others. especially Jews and other minorities. People started accusing Jews of poisoning wells and intentionally spreading the disease. It sounds completely ridiculous now, but back then, people believed it. Imagine someone who just buried their entire family, then is told the Jews are responsible for the plague. Now there is a specific place to channel the grief and rage. That exact scene happened all over Europe. It caused a wave of persecution and violence against European Jews that would not be exceeded until the 20th century. I think the Joker from The Dark Knight summed it up best. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. After the first major wave of the Black Death subsided, the survivors tried to adjust to life in the post-plague world. But the Black Death kept coming around. About every 10 years, the plague would sweep back through Europe and take out a bunch of the survivors. The disease aftershocks kept coming for 50 years and finally stopped after 1400. The final global death toll is usually estimated at about 100 million people. No other pandemic even comes close. In terms of total all-time dead, the Black Death is second only to smallpox. It is estimated that the Black Death pandemic took out 1/4 of all humanity at the time. The aftermath of the Black Death is just as important as the disease itself. China, the Middle East, and Europe today are not post-apocalyptic wastelands, which means humanity did recover. In China and the Middle East, the losses were terrible, but the societies eventually restored their relative status quo. Much of the Mongol Empire collapsed or split up, but for the most part, it was mainly a change in management. However, Europe took a whole different path. European society was so devastated that it resulted in a complete upheaval of the social, religious, and governmental order. Before the Black Death, Europe was a feudal society. Nobles controlled everything, and serfs were functionally slaves. The Black Death turned the tables because normal working people got hit hardest, which resulted in a huge labor shortage. It also bankrupted many landowners and opened up a bunch of new positions in the nobility for the wealthy without title. All of a sudden, able-bodied workers became a must-have economic asset. Average people now had bargaining power. The nobles and landowners had two options: offer the best deal or double down and make serfdom even more restrictive. Each nation's choice on which route to follow would carry consequences lasting even into the 20th century. Crackdowns were not well received. In England, it even led to a giant revolt. Feudal serfdom was mortally wounded. While Europe would still have monarchies and a titled aristocracy, it would never again be the same. Coming out of the Black Death, personal piety became huge. Faith in God and faith in the church became two different things. For people who made it out of the Black Death alive, it must have felt like an act of God. Many survivors became incredibly grateful to the Christian God and became highly devoted to the faith on a personal level. As part of the gratitude, they commissioned and created amazing art depicting scenes from the Bible. Today, we call that process the Renaissance. The church as an organization on earth was another matter entirely. The perceived failings by clergy shook people's confidence in the organized church. When the local priest does not come at the hour of greatest need due to fear for his life, it is understandable how people in a highly religious society would start doubting the religious institutions. People also could not understand how an all-powerful God could let things like this happen when they followed the rules set out by the church. So the church lost a degree of credibility about expressing God's will accurately. For those of you that want to look into all that on a philosophical level, read When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner. It also did not help that the composition of the clergy had changed drastically. Remember how the Black Death killed off almost all the genuine, good-hearted clergy? Well, guess who was left? The church desperately needed warm bodies and started taking anyone who would do the job. Unscrupulous people saw a chance for advancement. That means coming out of the plague, the church leadership contained lots of corruption. The Reformation actually began with Martin Luther's outrage at church practices that started after the warm body crowd took over. Yersinia pestis still exists in the modern world. It is no longer a death sentence thanks to antibiotics. However, diseases have been known to develop antibiotic-resistant strains. One theory for why the plague happened in the first place proposes that humanity's population had gotten too large, and nature responded. That was back when the world population was 450 million. Today, 450 million is not even 1/3 of China. Also, Yersinia pestis is confirmed present in California. Now doctors are beginning to warn of a potential plague outbreak in Los Angeles, and LAX is one of the top 5 busiest airports on Earth. The whole zombie apocalypse genre might not be so far-fetched. After all, it has happened before. The Black Death pandemic is one of the greatest and deadliest challenges humanity has ever faced. It is one of the top dividing points in all history. The plague is often considered the transition point between the Middle Ages and the modern era, which puts its importance on par with the fall of Rome. Those who faced the Black Death endured fear, suffering, and chaos on an extreme level. Across the world, survivors of a real zombie apocalypse rebuilt civilization from the ashes. The people of the 14th century are a testament to the strength of man's spirit. Across the ages, many epidemics have caused serious trouble. Even during the early 20th century, the Spanish flu struck during World War I and killed 50 million people. However, the Black Death stands far above the rest. There is only one other pandemic in the Black Death's league: the introduction of Old World diseases into the New World. Instead of a series of epidemics coming steadily over many centuries, the New World got them all at once in a disease tsunami. It is estimated that diseases from the Old World killed upwards of 90% of the native population. I also considered making this episode about smallpox in the New World, but quickly hit a barrier. Most New World cultures were tribal and did not keep written records. Many affected tribes were also far away from contact with Europeans when the diseases hit. Aside from European accounts of disease impacting the natives early in the process, there is really not much to go on besides guesses and estimates. There are also accounts of explorers stumbling on the aftermath, like the Lewis and Clark expedition. But that brings things right back into guesswork territory. I am just glad to live now. However, in the back of my head, there is the scary thought of some super disease. Boo! Happy Halloween, everyone! As always, we would love to hear your feedback and topic requests. Please comment, like, and share, or leave a review on iTunes so we can reach more people. You can also email us directly at historynachos@gmail.com. We have pages on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, and PayPal. For technological reasons, the older episodes are not on iTunes and SoundCloud, but are still freely available on YouTube. Please consider making a donation to support making more episodes. Any amount is greatly appreciated. The links to everything are in the description. Until next time, thanks for listening.